The story of Cleopatra begins not in Egypt, but in the bloodlines of conquerors. She was born in 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek royal family that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were not native Egyptians, they were descendants of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who seized control of Egypt after Alexander's death. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, was a weak and unpopular ruler, often mocked as Orleats, the flute player, for his love of music over governance. His reign was marked by bribes to Rome to keep his throne, draining Egypt's wealth. Cleopatra, his third daughter, grew up in Alexandria, the dazzling capital of Hellenistic Egypt, a city of towering libraries, glittering palaces, and scholars from across the Mediterranean. From childhood, Cleopatra was different. While her siblings clung to their Greek heritage, she immersed herself in Egyptian culture. She learned the language, something no Ptolemy before her had bothered with, and aligned herself with the priesthoods of Isis and Ra. This would prove crucial later, as Egypt's people saw her not just as a foreign ruler, but as a true pharaoh. But her path to power was not easy. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, his will declared that 18-year-old Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII, would rule jointly, a common but volatile arrangement. The young queen, however, had no intention of sharing power for long. Cleopatra's early reign was a dangerous game. The Ptolemaic court was a nest of intrigue, where siblings married for politics and murdered for power. Her brother's advisors, especially the scheming eunuch Pothinus and General Achilles, saw her as a threat. By 48 BCE, they had driven her from Alexandria, forcing her to flee to Syria. But Cleopatra was not one to surrender. She raised an army of mercenaries, preparing to fight her way back to the throne. Meanwhile, Egypt was slipping into chaos. A bad flood season had caused famine, and riots erupted in the streets. Ptolemy Xi's regime was crumbling, just as a far greater power was about to intervene. Rome, the mightiest empire in the Mediterranean, was in the midst of its own civil war. Pompey the Great, defeated by Julius Caesar at Pharsalus, fled to Egypt seeking refuge. Ptolemy's advisors, hoping to win Caesar's favor, beheaded Pompey and presented his head as a gift. It was a fatal miscalculation. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria days later, he was furious. Pompey had been his son-in-law and a Roman consul. Seizing the royal palace, he declared himself arbiter of the Egyptian throne dispute. Cleopatra saw her chance. Legend says she had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence rolled in a carpet, or perhaps a linen sack. When unrolled, the 21-year-old queen emerged, poised and persuasive. Caesar, a man of 52, was captivated. That night, their alliance, both political and romantic, was sealed. The next morning, Ptolemy XIII stormed into the palace to find his sister restored to power beside the Roman general. The young king's rage ignited a war. Ptolemy Xi's forces, led by Achilles, besieged the palace quarter. Caesar's small garrison was trapped, outnumbered by thousands. The great library of Alexandria caught fire in the fighting, though the full destruction would come later. Cleopatra, now fighting for her life, proved her strategic brilliance. She sent word to her sister Arsinoe, held hostage by Ptolemy's forces, to defect and split the enemy ranks. The war turned when Roman reinforcements arrived. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile during the final battle, and Arsinoe was captured. Cleopatra, now unchallenged, married her remaining brother, Ptolemy XIV, though Caesar was the real power behind her throne. In 47 BCE, she gave birth to Caesar's son, Ptolemy XV, better known as Caesar Ion. Though Caesar never officially acknowledged him as heir, he had a Roman wife and adopted nephew, Octavian. His presence in Egypt was a scandal in Rome. When Cleopatra visited the following year, she stayed in Caesar's villa, further inflaming his enemies. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated. Cleopatra, still in Rome, fled back to Egypt. Her world had shattered, but her story was far from over. With Caesar dead, Rome plunged into chaos. Cleopatra, now back in Egypt, faced a precarious future. Her brother and co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV, mysteriously died, likely poisoned on her orders, leaving her free to rule alongside her infant son, Caesar Ion. The message was clear: she was the true heir to Caesar's legacy, and Egypt would not bow to Rome without a fight. But Rome was fractured. The assassins, Brutus and Cassius, controlled the east, while Caesar's heirs, Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, formed the second triumvirate to avenge him. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, waited to see who would emerge victorious. When Brutus and Cassius demanded Egyptian support, she stalled, claiming famine prevented her from sending troops. In truth, she was buying time. The decisive Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE ended with Brutus and Cassius dead and the triumvirs dividing Rome's territories. Mark Antony, given control of the eastern provinces, summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus. He needed her wealth to fund his campaigns, but she knew this meeting would define her fate. Instead of rushing to obey, she delayed, then arrived in breathtaking style. Plutarch describes her barge with purple sails, silver oars, and herself dressed as Aphrodite, surrounded by attendants fanning her like a goddess. Antony, a man of legendary appetites, was instantly enthralled. Their first night together began a partnership and a love affair that would alter history. Antony spent the winter of 41 to 40 BCE in Alexandria, captivated by Cleopatra's wit, ambition, and sheer presence. Unlike Caesar, who had always prioritized Rome, Antony seemed willing to embrace her vision, a Greco-Egyptian empire rivaling Rome itself. She bore him twins, Alexander Aelios and Cleopatra Selene, further binding their fates. But Rome called Antony back. His wife, Fulvia, and brother had rebelled against Octavian, forcing Antony to negotiate. The Treaty of Brundisium in 40 BCE temporarily eased tensions, and Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia, to seal the peace. Cleopatra, now isolated, focused on stabilizing Egypt. A drought and economic crisis threatened her reign, but her reforms, lowering taxes, redistributing grain, kept her people loyal. By 37 BCE, Antony returned to the east, abandoning Octavia and reuniting with Cleopatra. He granted her vast territories, Cyprus, Crete, parts of Syria, an act Rome saw as treason. Worse, he declared Caesar Ion the true heir of Caesar, directly challenging Octavian. The stage was set for war. In 34 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra staged a spectacle that shocked the Mediterranean. At a grand ceremony in Alexandria, they sat on golden thrones, dressed as Dionysus and Isis, before an audience of nobles and diplomats. Antony proclaimed Cleopatra Queen of Kings and Caesar Ion King of Kings, distributing Roman-conquered lands to their children. To Rome, this was unforgivable. Octavian's propaganda machine roared to life, painting Cleopatra as a sorceress who had enslaved Antony with witchcraft. The Senate stripped Antony of his titles, and in 32 BCE, Octavian declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra alone. The final showdown was coming. In September 31 BCE, the fleets of Antony and Cleopatra faced Octavian's forces off the coast of Greece. Antony's ships were heavier, built for boarding, while Octavian's nimble vessels, commanded by Agrippa, outmaneuvered them. Mid-battle, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly broke through Octavian's line and fled. Antony abandoned his men to follow her, a decision that sealed their doom. The remaining forces surrendered, and within a year, Octavian invaded Egypt. Antony's armies defected, and by August 30 BCE, Alexandria was besieged. Hearing false news of Cleopatra's death, Antony fell on his sword only to die in her arms as she barricaded herself in her mausoleum. Octavian, now master of Rome, wanted Cleopatra alive for his triumph. But she outwitted him. After a final meal, she arranged for an asp, or perhaps poison, to be smuggled in. Dressed in her royal robes, she lay on a golden couch, accepting death rather than chains. With her died Egypt's independence. Caesar Ion was executed, and Egypt became a Roman province. Yet Cleopatra's legend only grew. A queen who dared to challenge Rome, loved two of its greatest men, and shaped history until her last breath. With Cleopatra's death, Octavian entered Alexandria not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order, or so he claimed. He allowed the queen to be buried beside Antony in a tomb whose location remains one of history's great mysteries. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, was extinguished in a single stroke. Caesar Ion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, was hunted down and executed on Octavian's orders, the last potential heir to both Egypt and Caesar's legacy eliminated. Octavian, now the undisputed master of Rome, took Egypt not as a province governed by senators, but as his personal domain. The fertile Nile Valley became the breadbasket of Rome, its vast grain shipments feeding the empire's growing population. Yet Octavian was careful to honor Egyptian customs, presenting himself as the successor to the pharaohs to maintain stability. He even paid respects at Alexander the Great's tomb, a symbolic gesture linking himself to both Macedonian and Egyptian traditions. Back in Rome, Octavian staged a magnificent triple triumph celebrating his victories in Illyricum, at Actium, and in Egypt. Cleopatra's defeat was the centerpiece, an effigy of the dead queen, complete with an asp curled around her arm, was paraded through the streets. But in a shrewd political move, Octavian spared her children by Antony. The twins, Alexander Aelios and Cleopatra Selene, along with their younger brother Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome and raised by Octavia, Antony's former wife. It was a calculated act of mercy designed to burnish Octavian's image as a magnanimous ruler. Of Cleopatra's 4 children, only one would reach adulthood, Cleopatra Selene. Her brothers, Alexander Aelios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, vanished from history, likely dead before adulthood. But Cleopatra Selene was married to Juba II, a North African king and scholar loyal to Rome. Together, they ruled Mauritania, modern-day Morocco and Algeria, creating a miniature Alexandrian court in the city of Caesarea. Cleopatra Selene never forgot her heritage. She minted coins bearing her mother's likeness and named her son Ptolemy, ensuring the dynasty's name endured. For decades, Mauritania thrived as a cultural crossroads, blending Egyptian, Greek, and Roman influences, a final echo of Cleopatra's dream of a cosmopolitan empire. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the memory of Cleopatra was systematically erased. Statues were defaced, records destroyed, and her official reign was backdated to end with Antony's death, denying her those final days of sole rule. Yet in the countryside, Egyptian priests and commoners quietly kept her memory alive, telling stories of the last pharaoh who had fought to preserve their kingdom. Even in death, Cleopatra escaped definition. Roman historians like Plutarch and Cassius Dio painted her as a seductress who corrupted great men, while Egyptian sources revered her as a divine ruler. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. She was no mere temptress, fluent in 9 languages, a gifted mathematician, and the only Ptolemy to bother learning Egyptian. Her alleged beauty, often exaggerated, was likely less about physical appearance and more about her charisma and intellect. The famous story of her dissolving a pearl in vinegar to win a bet with Antony was probably propaganda, but it captured her reputation for extravagance. Modern archaeology has peeled back some layers of myth. Coins bearing her portrait show a prominent nose and strong jaw, a woman who looked every bit the ruler she was. The discovery of papyrus documents signed by her hand proves she was deeply involved in governance, approving tax exemptions and mediating disputes. For centuries, archaeologists have hunted for Cleopatra's final resting place. Ancient texts suggest she and Antony were buried together in a lavish mausoleum near Alexandria, but the city's shifting coastline and urban sprawl have obscured all traces. In recent years, Dr. Kathleen Martinez has led excavations at Taposiris Magna, a temple complex west of Alexandria. Her team has uncovered a tunnel network eerily similar to ancient descriptions of Cleopatra's tomb, along with coins bearing her image and alabaster statues. Yet the queen's sarcophagus remains elusive. The discovery would be monumental, not just for the treasures it might hold, but for the chance to study Cleopatra's remains. DNA testing could confirm her ethnic background. Was she purely Macedonian Greek, or did she have Egyptian ancestry? While forensic reconstruction might finally show us her true face. No ancient figure has been reinvented as often as Cleopatra. Shakespeare immortalized her in Antony and Cleopatra as the serpent of old Nile, a tragic heroine torn between love and power. Elizabeth Taylor's 1963 film cemented the modern image of the queen: exotic, glamorous, and fiercely independent. Yet each era molds Cleopatra to its values. Victorian artists depicted her as a doomed romantic, while 20th century feminists reclaimed her as a proto-woman of power. Even video games, Assassin's Creed Origins, and anime, Cleopatra, Queen of Sex, reinterpret her story for new audiences. These portrayals say more about us than about her. The real Cleopatra was a master of realpolitik who used every tool at her disposal, diplomacy, religion, and yes, sexuality, to protect her kingdom in an age when female rulers were viewed with suspicion. History hinged on moments that nearly went the other way. What if Cleopatra had won at Actium? Had her fleet not been trapped by Agrippa's fire ships, she and Antony might have escaped to India, regrouping for another war. Egypt could have endured as an independent power, delaying Rome's imperial dominance. Or what if Caesar Ion had survived? A Greco-Egyptian empire led by Caesar's bloodline might have challenged Rome's supremacy, creating a Mediterranean world where Alexandria rivaled Rome as a cultural capital. These alternate paths remind us that Cleopatra's defeat wasn't inevitable. She came closer than any ruler of her time to uniting the East against Rome. 2,000 years later, Cleopatra remains a symbol of female power, of cultural fusion, of resistance against empire. Her life asks uncomfortable questions. How do we remember women who wield power unapologetically? Why do we reduce complex leaders to caricatures? Modern parallels abound. Like Cleopatra, female leaders today navigate a world quick to label them as either shrewd or shameless. Her multilingual diplomacy mirrors our globalized age, while her struggle against Rome echoes post-colonial narratives. Perhaps her greatest legacy is the sheer persistence of her story. In an era when most women were erased from history, Cleopatra ensured she would never be forgotten. As the archaeologist Zahi Horace once said, every generation will rediscover her. Because she is Cleopatra, and she belongs to the world. From a princess in Alexandria to a legend for the ages, Cleopatra's life was a tapestry of ambition, intellect, and resilience. She ruled in an age of giants, Caesar, Antony, Octavian, and made them see her as an equal. And though her kingdom fell, her name still burns bright, a beacon across the centuries.